The biblical tale begins when the Hebrew patriarch Jacob escapes drought in the land of Canaan, modern Israel, and moves to the land of plenty, the land of the pyramids, ancient Egypt.
The scene in front of us indicates a migration of Semitic people into Egypt. Women, children, animals and men walking with weapons as the Bible describes. These Semitic people are clearly different from the depictions of Egyptians all around them, for they have fairer skin, sharper features, and the men have pointed beards. These depictions date to the time of Joseph, and those characterized are wearing multicoloured coats. The Bible says that when Joseph invited his family to live in Egypt, that he gave them all new clothes. Could it be that the very thing that had divided them when Joseph was young, the multicoloured coat, was now a symbol of a gift that was bringing them back together?
The Bible records that at the time of their arrival, one Israelite rose to the highest levels of Egyptian power. His name was Joseph, son of Yaakov, Jacob in English, and he became so powerful that he wore on his finger the seal of royal authority. Professor Manfred Bitak found no less than 9 seals worn by Joseph's court officials. Inscribed right on them is the Hebrew name Yaakov, Joseph's father.
It's very strange that we found 9 seals with the name Jacob here. It's a biblical name, by the way. The original was probably mounted on a ring worn on the finger.
In a plot of land, later identified as Area F, they uncovered the ruins of a village. A map of the excavation site confirms its distinctly Israelite origins.
And there was one house in particular which was larger than the other houses. And it was laid out in kind of a horseshoe fashion around a central courtyard. And then around this rather large structure were smaller structures. And this perhaps may be the very first house built using this design.
Archaeologists immediately recognized that the design of this horseshoe-shaped dwelling was identical to structures built in Israel centuries later. It was a prototype of Hebrew architecture constructed near the time Joseph was believed to have lived in Egypt.
But it was a find at the back of the palace that most intrigued archaeologists. A tomb topped with a pyramid.
And inside this tomb chapel, we found the rest of a tomb statue.
The statue had been vandalized, but when reassembled, it shocked the experts.
When we get it back to the museum and restore it, it looks like this. And you can see that the head's been completely smashed, the lower part of the head, and the eyes have been gouged out. The most important thing is this. It's an amazing haircut. We don't see anything like that in Egypt before this time. And the hair colour is bright red. This guy had flame red hair.
The details were typical of Semitic people.
Another little detail is the skin colour. Here we can see the forehead, and this here is yellow skin. And that's typical of what the Egyptians did to represent foreigners from the north, people with pale skin.
It wasn't just on the hair and face that paint was found. Flakes of red and black paint were found on the outline of a garment, and with it, a distinctive pattern. Could this be a multicolored coat?
If you're trying to imagine the rewards of somebody who gave such service to Egypt, who saved it from the famine, you would expect these type of things to be given.
Most Egyptian tombs were stripped of treasures such as furniture, clothes, and jewelry. This tomb was no exception, but in this case, the bones were also taken away.
If a plunderer had gone in there to wreck the tomb, he would have left the bones behind. He wouldn't have taken the bones away. Bones don't have any intrinsic value. So somebody's removed the body from this tomb. Now, the story of Joseph is, at the time of Exodus, when Moses takes the Israelites out of Egypt, he takes the coffin of Joseph with him. So he would have left an empty tomb. So here we have a guy with a multicolored coat with an empty tomb. It's got to be Joseph.
And Joseph died, But the children of Israel were fruitful and multiplied, and the land was filled with them. Then there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said, "Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal with them, lest they join our enemies and fight against us."
For thousands of years, Egyptians mined turquoise in this area. Often they used slave labor. We learned of this place from old papers published in obscure journals. We came here to find proof of the slaves that Moses led to freedom. But even if we found evidence for the presence of slaves, how could we be sure that they were Israelites? The Bible provides us with two clues. First, the followers of Moses did not use hieroglyphic writing like the Egyptians. Rather, the biblical tradition states that they used an early form of alphabetic writing. Also, the Israelites did not worship Egyptian gods, but a single God that the Bible calls El. And sure enough, there are slave inscriptions here, and one of them records a 3,500-year-old cry. El, save me. This is the writing of a slave who worked in this mine. You can still see the chisel marks, which were part of the forced labor that the author of this inscription was involved in. And he wrote his cry to God.
Another mural, carved in a tomb wall during the 15th century BC, shows Canaanite slaves working in the vineyards of Goshen. And fragments of the Brooklyn Papyrus, dating back more than 3,700 years, report the transfer of domestic slaves from one Egyptian owner to another. Each slave was listed by name. More than half the names noted were characteristically Hebrew.
The 15th century Hebrew inscription Sinai 375A, associated with another one of those Egyptian turquoise mines in the Sinai Peninsula. It mentions the overseer of minerals, a Hisamach.
We saw a tall Egyptian overseeing the work, and the text says, "The rod is in my hand, be not idle." In the Bible, the children of Israel are beaten for not fulfilling their quotas, and they are told, "You are idle."
The bricks they made are still made and used in the same way. Mud is mixed with water, and then both are mixed with chopped straw. And the point of the straw is not only that it binds the brick, but that it prevents the mud from sticking to the builder's hand and the mold from sticking to the ground. So you can see that when the Egyptians refused to supply straw any longer, and yet the Israelites had to supply the same number of bricks, that their work would have taken them more than twice as long. And this was an irritating hardship. And when that type of petty persecution turned to real oppression, then in the end the Israelites rebelled and fled.
There were these Egyptian mines at a place called Serabet el-Qadim, and we found an inscription there in Hebrew, 15th century Hebrew, Sinai 361, that refers by name to Moses and the events recorded in the Bible in association with Israel's slavery in Egypt. And the relevant portion of the inscription reads, "Our bound servitude had lingered. At that time, Moses provoked astonishment." So here's an inscription in Hebrew to people being enslaved, and to Moses provoking astonishment.
Let my people go. 10 times Pharaoh said no to Moses, and 10 times God struck Egypt with catastrophic plagues, ultimately killing all Egyptian firstborn males.
We have this very interesting stela, which is dated to the reign of Ahmasi. It records a tremendous catastrophe that happened to Egypt. We're not quite clear what it was, but it involved rain and thunder and lightning and such a storm that rarely happens in Northeast Africa. I mean, that's a dry area. It sounds peculiar to me that the biblical tradition preserves the memory of plagues, which involve climatic cataclysms. And here we have, from the very time, this curious stela.
This papyrus now resides in Holland, and when it was interpreted, it compared favorably with the Bible's account. The Bible says in the book of Exodus, all the waters that were in the river turned to blood. The papyrus says the river was turned to blood. The Bible says the Lord sent thunder and hail and fire darted to the ground. So there was hail and fire. The papyrus says fire ran along the ground. There was hail and fire. The Bible says locusts went up over all the land of Egypt, and they ate everything. The papyrus says grain has perished on every side. No fruit or herbs are found. The Bible says there was thick darkness in the land of Egypt. The papyrus says the land is not light. The Bible says the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. The papyrus says he who places his brother in the ground is everywhere. The Bible says there was a great cry in Egypt. The papyrus says groaning is throughout the land, mingled with lamentations.
Finally, Pharaoh let the Israelites go, but then changed his mind and pursued Moses and his followers to the edge of the sea. It looked like the Israelites were trapped. But then the impossible happened. The sea parted.
This name right here, Nuweiba, Egypt, is short for this name right here, Nuweiba al-Muzayina, which means... it means the waters of Moses opening. This is Nuweiba, Egypt. This is the Gulf of Aqaba, and this is the side of Saudi Arabia.
Since the earliest explorations at Nuweiba, one distinctive type of formation has often been identified on the sea floor. A slender, table-like structure, sometimes standing on end, with a coral-encrusted base, a straight shaft, and a circular top.
It's a 90-degree angle, a right angle, between something that looks like an axle and the wheel.
A metal detector reveals that many of the formations off Nuweiba contain metal artifacts. I would estimate about 25% of the formations down there still retains enough metal to give positive readings on the metal detector.
Vivica also completed many dives on the Saudi coastline, directly opposite Nuweiba, locating and photographing coral-encrusted chariot parts near the shoreline.
And the Bible tells that Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore after they came across.
The scattered, irregular coral formations on the Saudi side of Aqaba resemble those previously found off the Nuweiba Peninsula. In the midst of them, Pan Chien photographed this circular object attached to what appears to have been a broken axle or hub.
Human remains have also been found, such as this coral-covered femur bone on the right. Lab tests confirmed that it is in fact bone. Other bones have also been found. A cross-section reveals the bone inside the coral.
This is the granite column of Solomon, and it says this column matches one on the other side of the Gulf in Saudi Arabia, which had the inscriptions intact. The Hebrew words Mitzrayim, which means Egypt, death, water, Pharaoh, Edom, Yahuwah, and Solomon were on that column. So what does that tell you? And it's Nuweiba, Egypt. That's where the column is found. And here's the column right here, which marks the crossing site. And in case you don't know, you'll find one of the columns on one side of Nuweiba, Egypt, as well as on the Saudi Arabia side, on the other side of the Gulf of Aqaba. But it says King Solomon had these columns erected 400 years after the miracle of the crossing of the Red Sea on dry land. Solomon's seaport was at the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba at Eilat, according to 1 Kings chapter 9, and he was very familiar with the Red Sea crossing site as it was in his neighborhood. The Bible even mentions this column in Isaiah chapter 19, verses 19, where it says, "And that day there will be an altar to Yahuwah in the midst of the land of Mitzrayim," or Egypt, "and a pillar to Yahuwah at its border."
In the book of Psalms, it talks about how God made water flow from rocks. He split open in the desert, and his people drank freely as though from a lake. He made streams gush out like rivers. Do you get that? And this split down the middle is interesting because either side of that crack is water erosion. These rocks have been smoothed off, as if there's been a river flowing there, but there's no water flowing there today, of course. Shortly after this, the Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites. Remember that story? And shortly after that, God instructed Moses to build an altar called Jehovah Nissi. And it's intriguing that this altar is right near that split rock in this area where the Amalekites would have attacked the Israelites. What does that remind you of? Can you think in the Bible of a 7-branch candlestick being mentioned? Well, here it is. It's in Exodus 25.